Hello everyone, we have a special guest today, American General Benu Hodgesu, who arrived here to participate in Vilnius Security Forum, right after the Munich Security Forum. He is the former Commanding General of the US Army Europe and a well-known military strategist. General, welcome to our Delfi studio today.
Thank you very much for the privilege.
Let's start with the first round of talks between the US and Russia. Ukraine is not happy that it wasn't invited to that meeting in Riyadh. The American administration claimed that this is the first step to establish enduring peace. What can we see really in results?
Well, I think it's a mistake that Ukraine is not in the middle of these conversations. I know that the Trump administration sees the talks in Riyadh as a continuation of the conversation between President Trump and President Putin versus the beginning of negotiation, but it reinforces the fear that Ukraine and Europeans and people like me have that this will be done over the heads of Ukrainians. Results, it looks like Russia is getting their maximalist position out first.
And now, after this meeting, we see that Trump demands elections in Ukraine, President one, and he incorrectly claims that Zelensky supposedly has 4% support only in Ukraine, and that Russia is capable of destroying 100% of Ukrainian cities very quickly, including Kiev, but it doesn't want to do that. So it seems Trump believes now in Russian propaganda totally, maybe after this meeting. And what should we expect then next?
Well, of course, each of those points that you just laid out, I completely disagree with them. The Kremlin wants Ukraine to have elections right away because they know that President Zelensky is such a strong and well-respected leader in Ukraine. Russia cannot destroy Ukraine. They've tried for 11 years. This war started 11 years ago, not 3 years ago. And Russia had every advantage. And still they only control about 20% of Ukraine, over 800,000 casualties. The Russian Air Force has failed. The Black Sea Fleet has failed. And that's without strong American support, commitment. So I think that the Russians, what the president has said is exactly the Russian perspective. I hope that others around the president will protect him from making terrible mistakes, believing the Russian side. Nobody trusts the Russians or should trust the Russians.
But why does he trust Russians? Is it like easier way to finish this war? Because it really depends on Russians to end this war.
Well, the Russians could end it today by announcing that they will leave. They're the illegal invader. President Trump said that President Putin told him that he wants the dying to stop. It could stop today. One person, President Putin, could create that opportunity. I think, though, that President Trump really does want the fighting to stop. He has a long record of opposing endless wars. And I think he also believes that once we have reached a settlement that is acceptable to everyone, including Ukraine, we don't want a resumption of the conflict. So these are both important. But the president also was going to expect European countries to pick up much more of the burden of maintaining security and stability in Europe, not just in Ukraine. I think, though, that Europeans have got to inject themselves into this. And of course, Ukraine is a sovereign country. Ukraine is not bound by whatever is agreed between the Americans and the Russians. So I think making it very clear what red lines are for Ukraine, for European countries is also, that's how you get a seat at this table.
We'll come back to Europe, but now I want to ask you about this statement of Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He claimed that both sides of the war will have to make concessions. Where do you think the American red line begins in terms of what Ukraine must sacrifice to satisfy Russia's ultimatums, and likewise from Russia's side?
Yeah, I have never understood this approach by Secretary Rubio. Why is Ukraine expected to make concessions? They're the ones, Ukraine is invaded by Russia. 20% of the country is already controlled by Russia. So I think for the United States, we should be demanding that Russia leaves, that Russia respects Ukrainian sovereignty, that Russia returns the thousands of Ukrainian children who have been kidnapped, and that Russian war criminals are held accountable. That's what we should be demanding. That should be the U.S. position, demanding from Russia. And I never hear condemnation of Russia. I never hear criticism of Russia. I never hear Russia must make these concessions. And so this is why I think a lot of people are very concerned about how these talks are going. Now, of course, this is kind of the opening phase. So if we can, as I listened in Munich to several senior heads of government and state and professional diplomats, people are saying, okay, this is the beginning. Russia, of course, is always going to put out their maximalist position and demand even more. So we're going to find out how good the American side is at doing these kinds of negotiations. I think that this is just the first phase. We are in what I would call the preparation phase, and this is where everybody is trying to feel the contours. What's out there? What are the positions? What are the red lines? What are the demands? That's the first step. The second phase, I believe, will be a ceasefire, a real ceasefire. And because nobody can trust the Russians to comply, there will have to be a force there to ensure the Russians comply. It cannot be like Minsk I or Minsk II. And then phase 3, after the ceasefire, then you can have real negotiations about future of the region, I think more than just about Ukraine. So I think those are kind of the 3 phases. Phase 1 will be is kind of the most difficult because people are trying to figure out who's doing what. I mean, even the U.S. side, they've already changed the players. General Kellogg is not part of the team that deals with Russia. And I think it was because the Russians didn't like him, because he is a pretty tough, strong guy that sees a Ukrainian perspective. So I don't like it that Russia is able to kind of dictate who's on the American team.
NBC News claimed recently, citing U.S. intelligence sources, that Russia is not interested in a genuine peace deal with Ukraine. What kind of game is Putin hoping to play with Trump?
Well, I think that, first of all, that's correct. Russia has no interest in doing anything where Ukraine is seen as a legitimate sovereign state, which is why they didn't want Ukraine involved in this, because they don't want to have, Putin, Trump, and Zelensky all at the same table where they would be, as the Germans would say, Augenhöhe, same eye to eye. And so that's going to be their approach to avoid giving any legitimacy to Ukraine as a state. And I think it's important to note that regardless of what the Kremlin says, they have never backed away from their objective of this war, which is to destroy Ukraine as a state and to destroy the idea of Ukraine as a state.
So what should we expect after this here in Europe? How do you think?
Well, there's 2 or 3 parts of this. First of all, of course, whatever the outcome of all of this is, whether it's a continuation of the war, an agreement, or whatever, European countries, including Ukraine, are going to have to deal with the consequences. If that's millions more Ukrainian refugees, if it's continued disruption of food and energy, continued destruction of European infrastructure. So Europe has to get involved. You can't just sit on the sides and complain. You have to get involved. And the fact is, the United States or the Trump administration has basically said, Europe, you're not relevant. You will do what we tell you to do. And the reason for that is because Europe has allowed itself, and I'm talking about in whole, has allowed itself to be seen as the junior partner, partly because countries like Germany, France, several other, the Netherlands, but also Canada, have failed to contribute in a meaningful way to collective security. They've allowed the United States to be the senior partner here. And so you can imagine then that in the Trump administration, it's kind of like, okay, you're not even willing to defend yourself, so you're not going to have a seat at this virtual table. And then, the other day, President Macron, I think this was Monday, so President Macron hosted several European countries to come talk about what do we do, and nothing came out of it. I mean, only one or two countries, UK and I think France, said that they would be willing to provide troops. Even Poland, Germany.
It seems he rejected this statement yesterday. He's not going to send troops anymore to Ukraine, Macron said.
Yeah, so that's my point. There is not even the willingness to take firm steps. So I hope again, remember, we're in the preparation phase. So we're still in this phase of everybody trying to figure out what can they do, what does the other side want. So it's going to be a lot of mixed signals coming as from all the different parties. But it still looks like Europe cannot. If you're sitting in Washington, you look across the ocean to Europe and you say, they still can't get their act together. Now, obviously, individual countries, here in Lithuania, no question about Lithuanian commitment to defense. The Poles, no question. Finland, no question. I would say Estonia, Latvia also, no question. But Europe as a whole does not look unified yet.
Meanwhile, the US is looking at lifting sanctions against Russia if the war ends. The two countries discussed even yesterday the restoration of their economic cooperation, in particular in energy. Is this the right way to encourage Russians for peace?
Well, I think what I heard Secretary Rubio say was that after there's an agreement. So this could be seen as a carrot, if you will, to the Russian side that, okay, if you play ball and we get to an agreement that's acceptable to everyone, including Ukraine, then yes, we can look at restoring, and I think most countries would like to get back to sort of business, but it would be a huge mistake if we did it prematurely, if Russia was rewarded without actually having done anything. The conclusion of the war has to include Russia paying for the damage it has caused in Ukraine. I hope that Europe will move forward with using the frozen Russian assets, almost 300 billion euro, use that to help pay for repairing the damage in Ukraine, but also these thousands of Ukrainian children, bring them back. All of these things should be part of the end state. So there's always diplomats, understandably, they want to get the deal. They want to get to a conclusion. And so everyone else has to say, wait a minute, getting a deal is not good if it's not a good deal. And I think this is where Ukraine and European countries need to really stick together here.
Yeah, General Kellogg, who you mentioned before, is now coming to Ukraine after Europe, and he had the task to talk to Europe and Ukraine. And there are any arguments left that they could put on the table for Americans?
You mean, is there something else that...
Yeah, I mean, from the Europe's and the Ukraine side, what they can propose else except that what they proposed already?
Well, the one thing that they should absolutely do is remind everyone that Europe also, the EU, has sanctions against Russia. And regardless of what the U.S. might decide about sanctions, Europe is going to maintain its sanctions. It's still going to avoid buying Russian oil and gas. So this, and what Lithuania just did recently, getting off of the Russian electrical connections, these are important economic steps. I think what the Baltic, all the nations on the Baltic Sea did back in January when they met to discuss the continued damage to underwater infrastructure, for example, in Helsinki. These are the kind of things that European nations should continue to do. But the most significant thing, I believe, would be for Europe to say, we will provide the force. We will provide the force that will go into Ukraine and ensure that the ceasefire is complied with. Now, of course, the Russians have already said, forget it, no way, no NATO country. Okay, why can they dictate that? I mean, Ukraine can welcome anybody in that they want. And so we should make it very clear that, when there's a ceasefire, that there will be European countries. And then Europe, after Europe puts together a force that would enforce the ceasefire, don't call them peacekeepers, because there is no peace to keep yet, all right, but enforce the ceasefire, and then ask the Americans for help with air power, logistics, intelligence, things like that. And I think that's an approach that would be acceptable to the American side. But we can't allow the Russians to dictate everything, how this moves forward.
But General, if you look at the capabilities of Europe, it's not in the position now to send enough sufficient amount of troops to Ukraine to deter Russia. As you mentioned, they don't contribute enough money for defense, so it's barely to protect themselves. What they can realistically to offer as a guarantees of supporting for Ukraine?
Well, actually, there are a lot of capabilities when you add together all the militaries of Europe. I mean, France, Germany, UK, Finland, Poland, and plus the smaller nations like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Norway. I mean, all of these countries, Spain, Italy, they have a lot of capability. Turkey, significant force. And the Turks are not intimidated by the Russians. And I think they can play a very important role going forward. So I think it's not a lack of capability, it's a lack of will for too many European countries to acknowledge that, okay, don't sit here and complain that you can't rely on the U.S. and then just sit at home and complain. Get off your bottom and go do something. And I think it really is a lack of will. But I hear people like the leadership in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. I hear President Stubb in Finland, Prime Minister Tusk in Poland. I mean, these are serious people. And, of course, these countries are the ones that are going to pay the biggest price if this fails in Ukraine.
But if you look at the situation when, for example, Russia attacks those European troops in Ukraine, what then? What to do?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is a very important point. I'm glad you brought this up. Whatever force goes in, these are not blue helmet UN peacekeeping forces. This has to go in as a real combat force with everything: air, land, sea, drone, counter-drone, long-range fire, missile defense, all the logistics, engineers, everything. And it has to have a very strong rules of engagement that would allow them to use force. And the Russians have to see that they are trained and ready to use force. In Minsk, you had these very brave women and men of the OSCE observer team, but I mean, they had soft hats and white cars. This is something completely different. This is a force that has to be well trained, with real capability, and with the authority to punch back because Russia will test the ceasefire immediately. They'll fly a drone over the first hour to see, no, we should shoot it down immediately. And I think we know from history that the Russians only respect strength. And if they see that we're weak or, is that really, then they just keep going. You remember when Turkey shot down a Russian fighter that violated Turkish
of course.
airspace, okay, on the
We
Syria
put it
border?
as an example, this case.
Yeah, and what did the Russians do? Of course, they did some embargoes. They got mad, but that was it. And so I think this is, at the end of the day, the Russians actually are cowards. I mean, they when you meet strong resistance, then I think we should not be scared.
As I understood you correctly, you believe it's not possible to achieve a really lasting peace without these security guarantees, without European troops on the ground, right? Because Trump claims that he seeks this, but actually it cannot be realistic if, for example, Trump goes after his term from White House, and what to do after that. So probably Russians will try to attack Europe, Ukraine again.
Well, if we get a real strong deterrent force into Ukraine to help enforce the ceasefire, during that time, of course, you know me. I want to see Ukraine in NATO. This is going to be a while. So until that time, during the ceasefire, Ukraine should be working very hard to repair the damage, to rebuild and modernize its forces, and European countries should be pushing as much into Ukraine as possible, so that Ukraine can be strong enough to deter Russia from a resumption. Now, the thing about the president, my president, is that even though it's frustrating the way he's doing certain things, and I'm not clear on everything he wants to do, the fact is he has enormous leverage over the Russians, huge leverage. He's got a very strong American economy. He's got strong support in the U.S. Congress, who love NATO, who love Ukraine, okay? So he's got everything he needs, plus 31 allies who also most of them want to do this. And we haven't even used our sanctions yet. I mean, you remember General Kellogg said that the Biden administration was a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10. So there's so much more economic pressure that President Trump could use against the Russians if the Russians don't move towards an objective. And of course, I don't know the president personally, but he seems to me a person who does not want to lose. He prides himself on being this great deal maker, and he does not want to be embarrassed or disrespected by anybody. And so if the Russians were to violate or show to be disrespectful or to not come along, then I think the president could very easily say, okay, we're going to destroy your economy. We're going to lower global oil prices by working with the Saudis and dropping our own prices and flooding the market with LNG, and we're going to give Ukraine everything that they want. I mean, this is the leverage he has, and I think the Russians they must know that. So let's see here in this preparation phase how much when they begin to move a little bit.
Europe is honestly shocked after J.D. Vance's performance at the Munich Security Conference where you were, and there are assumptions that America might withdraw its troops from Europe. In this case, what will it mean for NATO? How do you think?
Well, first of all, I thought that the president here in Lithuania, the response was the right response, that he was very sober, measured, And just, I think he described this as a wake-up call for Europe. I think he even used the metaphor, it's like a taser for Europe. And I've heard similar reactions from other European leaders as well. People acknowledge, while the speech itself was shocking in that it, in the content, it did tell Europeans that it's not business as usual. And that you can't just keep talking about we have to do more without actually doing more. That's not the problem in Lithuania. Lithuania is taking the steps that it should, but not all of your neighbors are doing that, particularly in Western Europe. You know, I live in Germany, and I have been hearing about it for years, but they still have not done what needs to be done. That's why they got tasered. Now, does that mean that the U.S. is going to leave Europe? Of course not. I do expect at some point that the administration will go through a review process that every administration goes through, you know, trying to match strategic interests with resources, priorities. And so, of course, what we have in Europe is going to be part of that review. Does that mean that there may be a reduction in rotational forces? I don't know. It could. Nothing is going to be sacrosanct. But, you know, think about what the U.S. interests are in Europe. First of all, there are hundreds of thousands of Americans that live and work all over Europe. We have billions and billions and billions of dollars of economic interests in Europe. The biggest trading partner for the United States is Europe. So it's in our interest that Europe is stable, secure, and prosperous. So I don't see a scenario where we pick up our ball and say we're going home. That would be bad for us. And of course, the Chinese are watching all of this to see if we are really serious about sovereignty, about respect for international law. So a big part of deterring China will be how we act in Europe.
I will ask a question, last one, but I need a short answer because it's time. Time is running. You previously presented a plan for Lithuania's defense in Vilnius, and if the war stops now, would Lithuania have to accelerate its defense preparations, and what would need to be done to achieve this?
So, first of all, Lithuania is doing a great job of improving its defensive capability. It's not just about spending money, it's also about modernization and organizing the right force. So, number one, very good. Number two, the arrival and the development of the German brigade that will be here, plus the Americans that are here, this is a real capability. So I think I'm very optimistic here. Number three, you have a big neighbor in Poland right next to you. I think this is probably an area where we could improve the relationship on the ground between Polish forces, Lithuanian forces, German forces, so that there is no question about who is protecting that famous Suwałki corridor.
Thank you, General, for your time. You're very welcome in our studio, so wait for you back.
Okay, it's a real privilege for me. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you.